Okay.
Yeah,
Should we begin with the chant?
sure.
Okay. So we're going to do the Sahana Vavatu Shantipat just to begin. And hmm. Om Sahana Vavatu
Sana vavatu.
Sahana O Bonaktu
Sana vonaktu.
Sahaviryam Karavavahai
Saha viryam
Karavavahai
karavavahai.
Tejasvi Navaditam Astu
Tejasvi navaditamastu.
Mavid Vishavahai Mavid
Mavid
Vishavahai
Vishwavahai.
Om Shanti
Shanti,
Shanti
Shanti,
Shanti.
Shanti.
Oh.
Thank you. Yes, so we are doing this talk tonight on the idea of freedom and skillful means. And we wanted to, these are two huge concepts, way bigger than we're qualified to address, way bigger than we really could fit into, a whole week's worth of exploration. But we thought we would kind of touch the surface on both of these, looking at how these two concepts that are really central to yoga, to Buddhism, to life in general in 2021, how those concepts are relevant and really important to bring focus to. And part of the idea for covering this tonight was looking at some of the places in scriptures where the word upaya, which is often translated as skillful means, comes into being in these different scriptures, but also looking at what that means, and then looking at what freedom itself means and how those two ideas interface. And part of the idea also came up because as we were talking about what are we going to do these monthly talks on, I remembered that when I was a brand new student to Richard's style of teaching, which was close to 40 years ago. The fact that I can remember anything from 40 years ago is pretty amazing.
I can't.
But those were the days when flyers were posted around town at the health food restaurants and things. And that's how I heard about his classes. And on his flyer, there was a wonderful picture of a yoga pose. And then the first phrase was that yoga is freedom. And I remember at the time seeing that and thinking, well, I could use some freedom, and let me check that out. And then, but really didn't know what that meant. But it's one of those words, like so many that we have talked about, that has this meaning that even if you don't really know what it means, there's something inherent in the word that makes you kind of wake up, makes your ears open. And so when we talk about freedom in yoga in that sense,
Yeah.
what did you mean? Have I gotten it yet?
Yeah, it's really confusing them because sometimes we think, oh, I just want to be free to go to any restaurant I like anywhere in the world, any time of day. Or I want to be free to, you know, go to a different planet, especially these days. But that's not what is meant by freedom. It's the idea being that one is free of suffering. Uh, and not necessarily free of pain, but one is free of the suffering, which is the entanglement through ignorance, with identification with things that you really aren't. And so the freedom is implying a kind of satisfaction. I don't know, the right word is hard to come by. And it's not inner pleasure, but it's nicer than inner pleasure, but it's a kind of deep um, wonder or a deep connection. Connection's better. It's a deep connection that is so nice, that you're willing to actually face the historical situation in the present of your embodiment in the present moment, in the present situation, without fear. Um, or if there is fear, then the ability then, because of that taste you have in your heart for freedom, it gives you the ability then to act and to do what is necessary. Because, and that's awesome, often takes more than courage. It's special. And that's what we mean when we're talking about the upaya, or the action. And so, and I want to refer you to the Bhagavad Gita, because this freedom and skillful means, or freedom and upaya, is really tells you a lot about what's going on in the book. And in the second chapter, which is the chapter where Arjuna is being introduced to yoga, being introduced to Sankhya, and in which the reader is being deliberately somewhat confused or tested as to their actual understanding. Yoga is introduced as Buddhi yoga. And Buddhi means intelligence, and intelligence is the deeper, wonderful function of the mind that allows you to not get things confused. So intelligence is what cuts through ignorance, and ignorance is, of course, the cause of grief or suffering. And so it's getting rid of ignorance that gives this sense of freedom. And then the question might come, how do you do that? And that's what the whole rest of the book is telling you.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that upaya appears as an actual word in the Gita itself, because it's not typically.
Not a lot. We
Yeah.
found 3 cases. We had to really look.
And it's typically a word that's much more associated with Buddhist studies and Buddhist texts.
Yeah, there are in different schools, different discussions of different types of these actions. But the most important one for us, because we're just beginning our inquiry, we've got millions of lifetimes to go, is chapter 2, which is a difficult chapter, verse 50. And I have to pull it up just to. Oh, there it is. And so it's talking, verse 50, Buddhi yukto jahatatiha ube sukrita duskrite tasmat yogaya yujyasva yoga karmasu kaushalam. And the word upaya isn't actually used here, but it's telling you, it's setting the stage so that you get a good understanding. It's saying that one whose buddhi is linked up, even when you're here in the world. And so it's, a lot of times people hear Sangha think, oh, the whole world is being impermanent. Let's get rid of it. It's stupid and I'm out of here. And so they're making that conceptual baggage, which is actually part of the world. And so if you have this, integrated, or you're yukted or yogatized in Buddhi, then you don't have both the sukrita and duskrita. So sukrita is good action in the normal sense of the word, in which you get pleasure or something you want, and duskrita is bad action or mistaken action. And sometimes, like in particularly these days, you're not sure whether you're going to do a sukrita or a duskrita. And, and you won't know until you try. And that's part of the thing. So because of that, if you're linked in yoga, you can just let go of this stuff or release it. Therefore, yoke yourself to yoga. Okay, so not to anything else. Yoke yourself to yoga. And then yoga karmasu kaushalam. And here is the great key. Yoga is the art of karma. Okay.
And karma meaning action.
Action. Okay. And so then we have to understand, well, do we mean by karma destiny, like the lot in life that I've been given due to my past actions? And we mean that, yes, but also we mean that your lot in action, you're given, which it's hard to get rid of, your given circumstances. Like this is the planet Earth, which has a climate crisis and it has a few political problems here and there, and some history, and your body isn't, has this incredible ancient history biologically, and so does the Earth itself. That was loud. And so karma, in a sense, it's given to you, but then it continues. So as you linked with intelligence, you start to see that it's continuously happening, and that you're acting all the time, or at least your body is acting. And if you really get into it, the mind is acting. And then the question is that me? And so that's a good question. When my hand is moving, is that me? When my eyebrows move, is that me? Definitely. Okay. When my mind is moving, which it tends to do on occasion, am I moving? And that's one of the great questions of the Vedanta. Don't answer that question, but just keep asking the question. So whatever the answer is, you just ask it again. And
all of those are action.
All of those are action. And those small actions in the present moment, like even a thought has residue or consequences somewhere, at least in maybe the immediate environment, and occasionally, particularly if you have good internet connection, they could have it in the really broad environment. And so the idea being that karma is discovered to be a creative function. In other words, I can actually create, at least in my little teeny corner of the world, I can make it shine, or I can make it function. And so karma is actually the art. And that's what karma is, an art. And what art does is allows you to teach or to use thought, which is sometimes presented as a problem, but it's thought that's seen through by the intelligence. And that thought is a tremendous creative power. And that is the skill. And so this is the first meaning. And so the word upaya isn't actually used here. But what's interesting is the verse right and before that, in which they're talking about, people think, well, then I'll just act. And so it says mere action is way below the yoga of intelligence, which is Buddhi yoga. And so you're supposed to take refuge in Buddha. And so Buddha sharanam anvicha. So you should take refuge in the Buddha, which sounds a lot like the Buddha. But it actually, technically in this case, means awakened Buddhi. And so, but I'm sure the person who wrote this was aware of that. And then it says, those who are motivated by the fruit of their action are pathetic. Oh, and so the fruit of the action is what you're going to get out of it. And but then again, and we've talked about this in some of the other
Ad nauseum.
ad nauseum. Okay,
So we won't go into it too deeply.
yeah, but if you're going to do any action, you're always going to have some level of attachment to the fruit, meaning I want to explain this clearly. Good luck. And but that would be the fruit. And then what you do, and this whole thing is you're giving away the fruit to others. And in that way, but you make the best fruit you can, and then you give it away. And so you're taking this skill of making good fruit, which could even be an intellectual thing, or it could be an actual farmer raising good fruit, but he's raising the fruit ultimately to give it away. And say you're selling fruit to make money, well, then when you get money, and there are a lot of people who need to hear this, your privilege is only to serve others with it. That is the privilege of aristocracy or wealth, is to then serve others. Otherwise, the attachment to it is complete suffering.
And this form of action that Richard was even talking about just now, the idea that teaching or offering ideas really is the foundation of communication, that you have to have this ideal that you want there to be the fruit of that action, of your communication in the form of your words perpetuating and enriching communication with others. And so that's a perfect example of how the idea of, you do something with a goal in mind to communicate, and then giving it away is the real joy. And that is experienced fully when you are in communication with others. And this interchange starts to happen. And so it's communication or teaching or being a student and communicating in that realm. Those are great examples of this idea of action and skillful action, where you are open to the process that is going on around you, to the point that you start sort of disappearing a little bit in terms of your own needs and desires. And it starts to be something that is unfolding rather than something that is, an ideal that you have to then stick to.
Yeah. And so the idea of giving away the fruit doesn't mean it's a bad fruit. Because if you're going to give fruits away, you want to give away the best quality. But let's get on with it. And so and the fruit of your action might be simply a very abstract philosophical thing, like a little, koan or something, or it could be, all kinds of different things. But the idea of giving it away is compared in the Gita, of course, to the idea of sacrificing, or it's like you have what your mind, being a typical mind, has created a holy space. It's like, oh, this is where everything makes sense, this holy space. And this is what mind does, is it plays these, that's the nature of mind, is to be religious and create, oh, this is special, and therefore, and so then you create that, and then the idea is to put it down or to let it go. And you want to let go of the whole thing with practice. And that takes practice. And that's the great skill or the great art, is how do I see through and experience the pleasure of the other as I place that down. And so the placing down or giving away is the radiance. So that's how the sun shines, is it likes to share its sunlight. Um, and so another place where the word upaya is actually used in the Gita is in chapter 6, which is the chapter on classical yoga, and verse 36. So it's easy. So chapter 6, 6 times 6 is 36. Okay. And that's maybe a coincidence.
Oh, no.
And so it's so Krishna is saying to Arjuna, I think yoga is difficult to grasp, and yoga, and he's before that talked about that yoga is this extreme satisfaction that one has with the self. And so the self is satisfied by the self, and you have to inquire, what do you mean by self? And you find this pleasure of seeing in all other beings yourself, and you see the self in all beings, and that gives you such this sense of like satisfaction and freedom that you don't need even to get anything that is constructed conceptually. Like you don't even need to get your concept of yoga once you start to feel the love of other beings in your heart. And so this is, but you have to focus on the Atman, and you pay meditatively this close attention to the Atman. And remember, the Atman is this direct experience that we have a great difficulty finding words for. But it is attainable by upaya. That's where the word upaya is actually used. This is where the word is interesting. And the words, let's look at, often translated as skillful means, well, let's take it back to an art form. And so if I can get you to get excited about the fruit of an action, a conceptual thing, like we're going to, improve the economy, and which could possibly happen, and somehow we then worship the economy as being a sacred thing, or I'm going to get some concept of liberation, or I'll get my own universe, or I'll become the CEO of a huge tech company, and I'll be able to fly into outer space anytime I like. And so these are initial concepts, and it's the basic process of yoga is the religious process. And so I concentrate. And then what's the skillful means is when you get someone to concentrate, and if it's done artfully, then that art keeps taking you back into the middle path. So this is what all the techniques of yoga are. All of them, every is a skillful means, or an artful means, or something that actually brings about what is actually being looked for.
And so in a sense, the word, the phrase skillful means, that is kind of a phrase many of us who've studied contemplative practices run into. It has a slightly confusing meaning in a way, because like so many sort of elements of any kind of jargon, we get an idea of what it means. The skillful means acting skillfully. And then but then we don't ask ourselves, what does that mean? And we were chatting last night with our friend Michelle, who's up at Menlo right now, and trying to remember what it is that our dear, dear friend and fellow enthusiast of contemplative practices, Dr. Bob Thurman, because I remember being in classes with him and he would say, skillful means it's a terrible translation. I never want to translate it as that. And I couldn't remember what it was he likes to translate it as. And one of the things that he always says that's so funny is that, I don't like calling it skillful means because it reminds me of the House Ways and Means Committee, which of course is the committee that oversees taxation in the United States. And it's sort of this not very necessarily skillful thing. And
it's not a skillful use of language.
No.
Some translations at different historical periods.
And so one way that many Buddhists and many yoga practitioners look at this term of skillful means is really the open and embracing action of ushering oneself and pointing others and facilitating the movement of others towards this place of internal freedom that we've been talking about, towards this place of emptiness or nirvana or the unspeakable, that is what we really get a taste for every now and then when we're doing our practices.
Yeah. So a skillful means that we like to use is we like to visualize as part of our yoga, say a beautiful deity. And that is actually an art. Literally it's an art. And it's, and when you start to do it, it's almost a trick, because if you do it really well and it's presented, you're going after, oh, I like that goddess, or I like that god, and they're smiling, I want to smile too. And so whatever the initial motivation is, it's when it's done artfully, it makes you look back again and again and again into what is really important, that which gives true freedom, which is this sense of internal, even the language, the word freedom is hopefully an artful word that, oh yeah, that's what I want. And, but eventually you have to see through the word itself as being almost a trick. And so because the mind is this thing that always gets things confused, where we confuse the name and form. And that's basic ignorance or confusion. So we get metaphors confused with actual things. It's like, oh, and the sharp, sharp intelligence keeps you from hallucinating or projecting permanent separate selfness into what's going on. And but we do that anyway. That's just what the mind does linguistically. And so we take that, and if it's done artfully, you're going to place down, even if you believe in the deity, I believe in your deity as a existential fact. And then when you get close enough through the art of it, you get the feeling in the heart of what's really being talked about, and you see right through the whole metaphor that who cares whether that's an actual, this is of no interest to me because of the taste of freedom that's in the mouth. And so that's the art of yoga. And so all of the actions in yoga that are done eventually are upaya.
And the thing that you notice as you act in the world and act with skillful means or not is that you dip into this state of whether you call it bliss or freedom or clear light or emptiness. You dip in just spontaneously. Yeah, so we were just, talking about the fact that the skillful means show up all over the place, and that the real way to feel skillful means, or the skillful actions that we can take, is that they resonate with this feeling of freedom inside that you get when you are really interfacing with the world and with others. And the way you get to that freedom is through waking up to the present moment. So in a way, it's this loop that is going on of, looping into waking up to the present moment so that you're there and able then to act skillfully, and then to act in a way that's resonating with your aesthetic, with your sense of meaning, with your sense of dharma, and with your sense of acting in the world in a way that resonates with your moral ground. And so when we began this talk with a little bit of, sort of like, well, what is freedom then? And so we've sort of danced around that idea. And we wanted to spend a few minutes here towards the end of this, looking at what we mean by freedom, because any of the actions that we take in the world, whether they be visualizations that we might do, or actual, well thought through actions that we do in terms of working with someone else, or presenting ideas in the world, etc. All of those things are somehow related to this idea of freedom. And when we conceptualize the idea of freedom, as Richard was saying, we run into this difficulty where, as soon as, like when I saw that poster that Richard had put up years and years ago,
it was a trap.
It was a trap. But that one of the things that I really resonated with was this idea that freedom had something more to it than simply my own lack of restraint from outside. But as soon as we say the word freedom, and especially in the world, the way it is here and now today, with so much difficulty politically, with the historical sort of unearthing of slavery in the United States and ill treatment of others across generations throughout the world. Slavery has been a part of human culture forever. Freedom then takes on the meaning of being not restrained, or in a way, curiously, as yoga is this yoking together, that in and of itself can start to sound almost like a restraint, like lack of freedom, if you misperceive it. Or we get the idea that I am free to do something. So free from something, or free to do something, like not wear a mask, or not do things that I don't want to do, not do the dishes.
I should be free to kill all of my neighbors and make everyone unhappy.
Yeah, I hope the neighbors aren't listening, because they already think we're weird.
That was a joke. But people think that's what freedom is.
Yeah.
But the word is interesting, and the word is an art form, because come on and get some freedom, and whatever you're going after, if the one who said the word is skillful or uses it as an art form, it at least gets your attention. And in getting your attention, then they can really help you to go deeply. And so that's the whole trick. So even if I say, we're going to teach the true Dharma, or and you go, oh, the Dharma, I want that. And that's just because you have some image in the mind of it. It's a sense object that you're going after, and that's what mind does. And so the art is Um, there was a Zen teaching that this upaya is, when the artists, they try to get their kids out of a situation which is samsara, but the kids are like, they're normal kids and they're all interested, and so they trick them. They say, "Oh, look what I have in my hand," and actually there's nothing in the hand, but they're saying, "Come on out and we'll share this." And so the kids run out of the burning house, and then the teacher goes, "Ha." There's nothing in the hand, but they get from it, if it's done well, they get like so much more than they were expecting from the word freedom. It's like endlessly more wondrous is to then experience the joy of actually loving other beings and being
And so
one
freedom
with them.
really becomes, when you look at it that way, it is a sort of an underpinning of being a human being, the state of freedom, rather than what we might objectify as freedom. Because as soon as you say free from something or free to do something, there is this sort of objectification that begins to happen. And when the objectification happens, then divisiveness becomes a part of the concept. And so freedom, which in a broad sense is completely unobstructed and is a state of being in a way very much like
Mm.
the state of love or the state of compassion, is this state of unobstructedness that is the freedom to dip down into humanity, dip down into the human condition, into the state of being awake, being alive, into emptiness, essentially, into being part of something far bigger than oneself that then becomes separate. And so, really, truly, what we're looking at is how do we take action? How do we pause and take actions in the world that allow us and facilitate for others the ability to tap into that inherent feeling of freedom that we have? And you look at animals in nature, or you look at tiny little babies when they've just been born, or as they're, I've been following a friend who's got a like 4-month-old baby now, and I get pictures every day, and just watching this amazing joy that this brand new individual to this world is experiencing with everything that is going on around him. And then this complete lack of self-awareness and connectedness. And that is, a very beginning part of what we are cultivating through the yoga practices and through being in alignment or attunement with our ethical standards, with our moral ground, with our aesthetic uh, likings, with other, with nature. Um, that those are the things that really represent freedom. So one way to look at freedom, which I think is quite fascinating, is, one of the things we do sometimes is to just say, you know, remind ourselves that we're grateful for this or that. So we practice the idea of gratitude. And when you remember that you're grateful for things, even though you're suffering so profoundly because your internet connection went down or whatever, um, you you realize that there is so much more to be grateful for. And in a sense, practicing this unobstructed connection to the human condition that is really freedom, um, and dropping into that, pausing and remembering what the embodied feeling the embodied sensations of that deep connection to, what might be called nirvana or other, or stepping out of your own little world, what that feels like. And just remembering the physical sensations that are associated with that is a way, in a sense, of practicing freedom so that it doesn't become something that I have and you don't, or that these people will not have because I want them to do something my way, or I will not have because someone wants me to do something their way. So freedom starts going into a different realm that relates directly to this idea of guiding one another to the space in the core of the heart where we all coexist and embrace one another and embrace life. So it's an interesting sort of parallel to look at these two concepts, to look at our own perception and our own conceptual misperception sometimes, as Richard's saying, the overlay of idea of what freedom, of what skillful mean, and what they manifest as, and what they actually are, and being able to not rip them apart, but to allow them to sort of mature and help each other. So it's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, if you look at Sankhya, that all of manifestation, space, time, mind, past and future, even gazillions of billions of forevers, all of that is upaya. And it's this, it's almost like the dovetailing of this tendency towards ignorance, which is called space-time. And it's that in itself, it's not like you're trying to get something out of that in itself is awesome. That if you actually return to it, so the word remember, or the word smriti, actually is the word for mindfulness. It means you're going back to the immediate experience, that which is actually arising immediately as sensation, not as our concept of sensation, though you got to start there, but as the prana itself is this vibration, which is, and that's what you're doing when you're practicing. So we use concepts. We use concepts of prana, like sound. If we're to be artful, to get you to listen to pure sound. Okay, that might happen. There's actually no technique for it, but you can trick people into doing by saying, "Oh, do you hear those birds over there?" And you think bird, and you start to listen, and then you keep using that art form to get people imagining the birds are building nests in their ears. Oh, and then occasionally you just go back to your basic mindfulness of prana and apana, and you go, ah, and for a moment you get that taste of freedom, which leaves a freedom samskara, which eventually, through the same process, will have to be
let go.
Yeah, released.
Yeah.
But the whole universe is upaya, the divine prakriti, the clear light. All of that is what we mean in this case by skillful means, and it allows you to address even the most difficult truth of the fact of impermanence, which most people they can't go there, and like and so it's the art of those who are compassionate, who are awakened, is to use this form of skillful, or excuse me, artful actions. It's hard to explain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's actually mentioned
Yeah.
again in the Gita.
It's in a couple places in the Gita. We couldn't find it in the Yoga Sutra.
Not with those, yeah.
With that exact terminology,
Yeah.
though there's a lot of reference to it,
Oh, yeah.
to the idea of it. And then the idea of its interfacing with freedom, and the notion that is very clearly put out there in these texts, that when we are really experiencing a sense of freedom, that there is a certain amount of responsibility that goes along with it. That the freedom is not something that is something ours to keep, but the responsibility starts to be this joy that is experienced, that becomes a huge core part of freedom itself, the responsibility of interchange and sharing and allowing actions to reflect that. So it becomes this sort of, pattern of action and freedom and interchange that that is like a the sort of unending, unfolding pattern. So it's quite something to think about, and we really, we've been giving it a fair amount of thought over the last few days, just thinking about this talk, and encourage you, as you're doing your asana practice, your meditation practice, your pranayama, chanting, visualization, all the other practices you do day in and day out, that you let these ideas sort of rest in the background, because the idea of being free or not free, being sort of under the restraints of your practices, or having to do your practices, or your actions that might be well thought through or not so well thought through, rather than sort of worrying about them, get some sort of general feel, an embodied sense of when you remember acting in a way that helped you to feel more connected to that space inside that we're talking about, whether the unspeakable, and also what it feels like when you are experiencing true freedom. And if you don't really know, that's fine, because that gives you ground to start exploring. Well, what does freedom feel like? What does skillful action feel like? And in fact, we've all done those two things. We just may not be aware of it. And the more you become aware of their interplay, and the more you become aware of what it feels like, then they stimulate, that feeling within you, and they become more naturally accessible.
Yeah. Another place in the Bhagavad Gita is chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. So the end of verse 10 is where you actually see the word upaya again. But the previous verse talks about tesham satata yuktanam, those who are always linked in yoga, bhajatam priti purva, who are full of the joy of bhajan. I should just read it because I am forgetting it. But the end of the ninth verse is tushanti cha ramanti cha. And that means that you're contented and delighted because you're always bodhayantas paraspa, awakening each other. And this is where the real pleasure comes. Even if you're already awakened, which of course most of us we already know all this stuff. But
Most of you do.
yeah, and there's
We're
great,
working on it.
there's great pleasure in waking each other up anyway. So there's an immense, and that's part of the, you shouldn't say the game of life, because that sounds like taking it, but that's part of the joy. But the pleasure is so thought. And then the 9th verse so Krishna, who's redefined himself as the real you, the you of you, and the you of everybody else, the beloved, with all their thoughts in me and with the pranas, matgata prana. So all of the pranas are flowing. So this is the esoteric yoga. Remember, prana is the immediate rising of what we tend to call spanda shakti, or sensation. That's where you're going back to in smriti practice or memory practice. And that's what is actually arising in your face as the present moment, as touch, as sound, as sight. And so then with that pleasure, you're filled with joyous love, you're continuously devoted, and then from within the heart, Krishna says, I give Buddhi yoga. And that's how they actually achieve. The upaya is the gift from others. So it's not something that is achieved mechanically by one's own actions, but it is actually through, we wake each other up. And so it's always never the result of a causal process, but that's why it's an art. Anyway, we should get to work with it. There's a lot to do.
So we'll leave it at that for this evening. We will turn the recording off and hang around if anyone has questions, but we'll stick around for that. So thank you so much. And please, as always, keep practicing, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.